matter what, always got to be repping Penn State. It's definitely been a difficult week as a Penn State fan, someone who's been following the program for a very long time, and it's definitely a lot to take in. I remember I was just, you know, going to church after Sunday, then finding out about James Franklin. I didn't think the report was real at first. I was like, you know what, it's just a rumor. Kind of like how everyone says that Billy Napier is going to get fired after every loss, and you don't really believe it. And then lo and behold, Penn State makes the move, and it's one of those things where I totally get where Pat Kraft is coming from, saying, "Hey, we expect you to win a national championship. Hey, we have these expectations, this, that, or the other." But I think what a lot of people don't really keep in mind is just how difficult it is to have that type of success year in and year out. I mean, when you have an overall record of 104 and 45, 64 and 30, 36 as a Big Ten head coach, and he's been a head coach for over 15 years, whether it was his 3-year stint at Vanderbilt and then 12 plus at Penn State. And I think James Franklin is a phenomenal coach. He's a great recruiter, but it's pretty evident that his glaring weakness is just game management in those critical situations. Whether you want to go back to the Oregon game or whether you want to talk about Ohio State from 2024, it's just countless games and countless examples of just not being able to get the job done. And it's unfortunate, but at the same time, I think another thing you have to think about in terms of this job overall is just this James Franklin hiring can kind of serve as a catalyst for a bunch of other programs doing the same thing. Another example that a lot of people aren't talking about as much as Florida State, for example, with Mike Norvell. If this keeps going to, a below 500 mark or a 6-6 year, don't be surprised if Florida State pulls the trigger on that 50 million plus. So I think what you're seeing now on top of just the NIL and the transfer portal and all that is I think you're just going to see a lot more football programs just be relatively impatient with their head coaches. Now, granted, there's always some exceptions in terms of, if you have the right base, you have the right facilities, you have the right structure in place, then yeah, most head coaches should be able to get the time that they need to succeed. However, in this day and age of college football, it's just simply a lost art anymore. I mean, back when, I was watching as a kid in the 2000s, I mean, for the most part, if you were pretty much a legend if you won 6 or 7 games. And even if you had a losing record for the first, 3 seasons, you really only had to prove yourself until year 4 or 5. And that scale is just dramatically decreased now to the point where, most schools only give you 2, maybe 3 years to really kind of pull out a winning record. And if you don't do that, they're just going to can your ass. And that's just kind of the way it is, whether we like it or not. I mean, I want to believe that Penn State is right. I want to trust that they know what they're doing. There's just in that back of your mind, you just kind of sit there and say to yourself that people might not be appreciating what he actually really accomplished and what he actually really brought to the program. Now, granted, I mean, James Franklin said in the preseason and the offseason that, hey, this is my best team yet. He convinced 10 players that I think could have been NFL players to stay for another year. I'm sure they're all regretting that now, but it's a polarizing situation, and quite frankly, just a situation I don't think we've ever really seen before. I mean, what do you really compare that to? I mean, you can't really compare it to when Woody Hayes got fired at Ohio State after punching that guy in the face. You can't really compare it to that. I mean, Mike Norvell last year, they went 2-10, but he got another season out of it and was able to see it through. So it's one of those things like, hey, I'm not defending necessarily that you lose to UCLA and you lose to Northwestern, but push comes to shove eventually. But, Penn State, I still think is one of the best jobs in the entire country. I'd say out of the job openings that there are at right now, I'd certainly say that that's the best. I'd probably even argue it was a better job even more than Auburn or Florida if those jobs hypothetically opened up. So there is a give and take, and it's just a fascinating spot for Penn State to be in because this job, in essence, is really going to be the deciding factor in terms of how long is this rebuild going to take? Is this going to be the type of thing where they poach a Marcus Freeman or an Eli Drinkwitz or an Urban Meyer or they get Urban Meyer to stop with Fox Sports and come in and take this over? I mean, those are the kind of conversations that we're going to have at this point. And, with that said, I have a couple candidates that kind of come to mind for this Penn State job that I definitely think are worth going through. But, a couple guys that I'm going to start off with who I don't think should get the job. Obviously, Kirk Cincinnati signed a huge extension yesterday. So I knew that wasn't really going to happen to begin with. However, it's always worth mentioning his name. He's done a phenomenal job in Indiana. He did at James Madison. He did at Elon. And it didn't really make a lot of sense for him to begin with, because if Indiana's giving him all the resources that he needs, and not to mention the pressures of the expectations that Kirk Cincinnati has is significantly less than he would at a Penn State or a Michigan or any of those schools, then why would you even leave to begin with? Now, granted, now he's one of the highest paid head coaches in the entire country. So now he's going to have to win, and now there's going to be some sort of expectation. But nevertheless, that fit didn't really make a lot of sense, at least in my opinion. Now, I've heard a couple other names. I don't, the likelihood that Urban Meyer or Ed Orgeron or Nick Sirianni, if he got fired with the Eagles, the likelihood of any of those names coming up doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. To me, if I'm a Penn State fan, as someone who's a Penn State fan, there's a couple of things I'm looking for. I'd say ideally, you're either looking for a guy who either has a connection to the school or has at least recruited in the Northeast at the very least. I would say another thing is someone who is just a program stabilizer, somebody who you can rely on, someone you can count on, and someone that you can say, hey, this guy's going to be loyal, this guy's going to be a leader of men, and he's going to be able to dominate recruiting in the area. And I think another thing that what makes the Penn State job so attractive as well is the fact that you're, compared to the SEC, I mean, your path to success in the Big Ten is a lot different. I mean, granted, you're still facing the Ohio States of the world, still facing the Michigan, still facing the USC. So it's not like there's no one there, but at the same time too, there's just less barriers to entry, I guess is the best way to phrase it. So, I mean, as much as I'd love to see Marcus Freeman, I don't see Marcus Freeman making that move simply just because I would probably argue it's probably more of a lateral move than anything, considering that Notre Dame and Penn State are recruiting a lot of the same guys. The overall structure and the tradition and everything like that is relatively similar in that regard, in terms of when you kind of ask yourself, like, hey, how do you sell Penn State to a recruit? How do you sell Notre Dame to a recruit? How do you sell them in the terms of the transfer portal? So all those things kind of come into fruition as well. But we'll start off with Matt Rhule. I mean, obviously Matt Rhule is going to be the big elephant in the room, right? I mean, we know his connection to Penn State. He was a linebacker there in the late 90s. He's really good friends with Pat Kraft. He has a very successful, proven track record. He's only 50 years old too, so definitely on the younger side. He coached the Carolina Panthers from 2020 to 2022, has been successful at both Temple, which is pretty regional, to Penn State, and also Baylor as well. So when you kind of put that all together, I mean, Matt Rhule's a really fun guy. He is a guy that can recruit, is a guy that is a program stabilizer, like I said before. However, the two issues that you have with Matt Rhule is, one, he has a lot of similar attributes to James Franklin, in the sense that when they've played ranked competition, when they've had these big games, for example, I think of the Michigan game a couple weeks ago where Nebraska was in the driver's seat for a while, and then, they ended up not being able to get the job done. So I think those are the kind of things where if I'm paying a $50 million buyout, and then you bring in somebody who has a relatively similar issue to James Franklin, I think a lot of people could be a little bit upset about that, especially, it's one thing to do it at Temple and Baylor, right? But it's another thing to do it at a legitimate power conference program. But the good news is Nebraska does really have quite a favorable schedule the rest of the way. So I think it's very viable that they can win 10, if not 11 games this year. It's just the matter of, okay, he came on the Pat McAfee show and essentially said, hey, Nebraska is a top tier program. I'm going to be staying, and I'm ready to do this, even though I think it's fairly obvious that Penn State probably is his dream job. So I think it's going to depend on how Nebraska finishes the year. But also, I think you have to assume at this point that Matt Rhule and Dylan Raiola are a package deal. So if Penn State can somehow finesse themselves into that position and be able to poach both of them, I think it is a solid option. But I only push back on it because I think a lot of the are just as evident in Matt Rhule. So I think you are kind of taking that risk of being 3-4 years down the line with Matt Rhule, then we're having the same conversations year in and year out. But I think for me, my favorite candidate for this job has got to be Matt Campbell over at Iowa State. I mean, he played college football at Pittsburgh and Mount Union, so he's a regional guy. He understands the landscape there. And, before he got to Iowa State, I mean, they were, pretty irrelevant, all things considered. I mean, since he joined the program back in 2016, he's made them pretty much Big 12 contenders for a good number of years now. And he's a 2-time Big 12 Coach of the Year, 2 top 15 finishes with the Cyclones. And, when you think of the rap sheet in terms of guys that he's developed, you think of Brock Purdy. I think of Breece Hall, David Montgomery, those guys that within the NFL. And, Matt Campbell gets thrown out for every job, and rightfully so. But I think this job makes a little bit more sense given his background, given his success, given his experience. And I think what Matt Campbell's done a really good job at is just really being patient and kind of asking himself, hey, what is really going to be the right job that propels me from a good coach to a great coach? And I think Penn State could be that job for him because he's still a pretty young dude. So there's no rush for him necessarily. I mean, it could be the first job that legitimately lures him away because I'm sure he's had to have the same sort of talking conversation for the past couple of years now. And for the most part, he hasn't really bid on anything. But, at the same time too, the Big 12, as much as I love watching the Big 12 and they're fun, there is a certain type of ceiling from a Big 12 program. So it's just one of those things where if he does have interest, which I would imagine he at the very least does, and you would be able to have the ability to have the resources that you would have, then, if you can be able to build that with those resources, build a successful and sustainable program, I think if you're Matt Campbell, you at least got to entertain a conversation with him. And I think you have to be really excited if you're a Penn State fan, because I think Matt Campbell for me would absolutely be the guy. But, another guy I'm going to throw out there too that I don't think has gotten as much discussion as I would like to see is Eli Drinkwitz over at Missouri. Now, granted, there's going to be some issues in terms of them trying to figure out the buyout situation, how all that's going to manifest itself. But what Eli Drinkwitz is going for him is a couple of things. I'd say first and foremost, his success up to this point at Missouri has been absolutely phenomenal and something that I think gets thrown under the radar, in my opinion, a little bit too often. Now, granted, I said before the Missouri game against Alabama, I really thought they were going to pull off the upset. They're such a complete team. Ahmad Hardy is just an absolute beast. And what's most fun about Missouri, at least in my opinion, is they always find different ways to win every year. And they've proven that time in and time out. And when you have the resources at Penn State, it definitely makes it a little bit more viable. Now, I think a lot of people that don't watch as much college football in terms of the entire country, I think some people could push back on Eli Drinkwitz in the sense that it's not necessarily the sexy hire, for example. It's not the hire that's going to get, a lot of press attention in that way too, because, they're also renovating Beaver Stadium, which costs them approximately $700 million too. So there is that risk that you kind of have to ask yourself too. Now, granted, there's always some inherent risk in that no matter what, but I think if you're Penn State, I really think you have to take Eli Drinkwitz in there as well, because, at least for me, if I'm sitting there and I'm saying to myself, hey, I legitimately would consider poaching someone from, an Iowa State or Nebraska, I think you have to throw Eli Drinkwitz in that mix, just because, he's a youthful guy. He understands what it takes to build programs and quite frankly, the guy's a winner too. And I think he can definitely translate that success to Penn State. So I think that's another name that you have to throw out there. And the last name I'll throw out there too, as just kind of a little, fun hypothetical is, I wouldn't be opposed to giving Bill O'Brien a call. Now, I know that people aren't necessarily thrilled about that or excited about that. If you just look at his track record at Boston College, he's in his second year now, 7-6 last year, off to a abysmal 1-5 start now. But if you really just want a guy who's just kind of a hometown guy, someone who can stabilize the program, Bill O'Brien could be that guy. Now, granted, would I pay someone $50 million and go out and get Bill O'Brien? That's probably going to piss some people off. But at the same time, Bill O'Brien is a guy that loves Penn State. He loves being in the Northeast primarily because of his family. That's one of the reasons why he said he went to Boston College to begin with. I think he's a really underrated offensive mind, something that he doesn't get credit for as much as he should, particularly when you think about his stint in Alabama. And also, he just has an extensive track record at, being successful and, in different endeavors. I mean, you can go back and look at the Houston Texans. You can look at his success in the SEC and, Boston College to some degree. I mean, Boston College is definitely one of the tougher jobs in the country, but nevertheless, I think you have to give Bill O'Brien at least some consideration or a phone call if, for example, a couple of those other guys don't pan out necessarily. If it gets to one of those positions where, hey, you strike out in your first 2 or 3, if you try to go after Freeman, Drinkwitz, and Campbell, and let's say all those guys strike out and you're kind of just looking around and saying, who else could we try? Bill O'Brien, I think, would just be a safe conservative option. And maybe you wait until a year or 2 or 3 to kind of think about your next candidate. But for me, I think Matt Campbell would definitely be the guy I want, but I think Matt Rhule would be a great option. I talked about Bill O'Brien a couple seconds ago. I think he would be great as well. People have kind of thrown out there like the John Summeralls of the world, the Alex Gouleches of the world, the Manny Diaz's of the world. And Manny Diaz is the only one who has a connection to Penn State to begin with. But the only reason I don't think it's worth mentioning any of those guys right now is just simply because, one, they don't really have a connection to the school, and 2, most importantly, they're just going to get thrown out for every single head coaching search no matter what. So when I'm kind of ranking my top candidates, I'm really kind of sitting there saying to myself, okay, who are guys that not only would be a great candidate for the job, but also, most importantly, who's going to be a great fit for the job, most importantly.